is this session is being recorded. I do that because coalitionevaluation.com, who is one of the hosts of this series, has a YouTube channel, and we are putting the webinars up on the YouTube channel. I also, in case anybody probably has not been there, but also on that YouTube channel are also what they call their tip video series, and the tip video series is basically a way to help transfer the information that you have in the webinar back to your coalition. So as we did last time and as we will do today, we will introduce some templates and some forms to help you carry this conversation further. And what we do in the tips videos is it's like a 5-minute video that just walks people through the exercise. It explains why the exercise is important, and it talks about how you fill out the forms and what you should do with them. The idea behind the tip series is that's something that you could, if you're going to do something in a coalition meeting around one of the topics that we're doing a webinar on, you could show that video to everybody in the meeting. Instead of introducing it yourself, they would be able to get a feel for the topics that were covered in the webinar, which will provide a context for that form or that exercise. And then, as I said, I walk through the exercise specifically. It's just, I guess, a tool to help people transfer that information over. The other thing I know that some folks have expressed interest in is just telling coalition members, hey, we're going to be doing this exercise. Can you just watch this video before the meeting, so you are prepared for that. So we are recording it, and it will be on the YouTube channel, and I'll put that information up at the end, near the end, as we move forward. This introduction is really the first step to a deeper understanding of evaluation, right? As I said last time, for those of you who have been a part of both of these webinars, I have been on both ends of a lot of seminars. You can imagine, in 18 years of coalition evaluation experience, I have sat on both ends of presentations, lots and lots and lots of them on coalition evaluation. And one of the things that I noticed recently, I guess sometimes when you're so deeply embedded in something, you don't notice it, but one of the things that I noticed recently in looking back, it almost always seems that when there's some type of a workshop or a webinar on some topic about what the coalition is doing, there's a tendency, I think, for coalition folks to feel like they have more to do when they leave the session, right? It's like, gee, we didn't have enough to do already. Now you're telling us we should be doing this too. And I get that, and I understand that. And just as the previous webinar was not about that, this is not about that either. This begins with where you are, which is why we appreciate your participation later. And even if there are things to do, which there will be, I would think that this is where the role of the evaluator comes in. If you are using an outside evaluator, or if you're using an evaluator who's internal, and this would be true for anybody who is on this webinar who maybe is not directly involved in the coalition. I know that there are some program folks who are involved in this too. This conversation is really for whoever is doing the evaluation. You need to have an understanding of how to bring this material to them, and that's the way this webinar is geared. So it's really the first step of a deeper understanding, the first step towards a broader conversation about, hey, let's look at where we are in terms of our evaluation and see if we're doing all that we can be doing, and most importantly, see if we're getting everything out of our evaluation that we can get out of it, right? So definitely this should be a conversation that involves your evaluator eventually. Today, we're going to introduce the standards in evaluation, obviously. We're going to talk a little bit about how applying the standards can help you. We're going to do a brief overview of the JCSEE Standards. I will give you the links to both the book, which we'll talk about in a second, that really describes everything there is to know about these JCSEE standards, but also the web link that will provide more basic information like we're covering today. I'm very interested in figuring out what stands out to you in all of this. This is the first time that I recall anyone ever having this conversation with coalition folks anyway. In my 18 years, and I have evaluated programs, I have evaluated communities, coalitions. I have never seen a presentation on this topic before. So I really have no idea what you folks may take away from it. And that's what I'm hoping to get out of you as we move forward, is what stands out to you guys. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what some next steps might be, some concrete steps that you can take if this topic interests you and if you think that you do want to move forward in thinking about how standards can be applied to your work. So again, we're going to start with the chat window, and I'm going to put something up here, and I want you to put yourself, think of what you're about to see from the perspective of a partner, a community member, or potentially a funder, right? So suppose you saw this statement either in a grant application if you're a funder, or in some type of materials that goes out to the community or partners. And here's the statement. And I just made up the coalition. So the ABC coalition of any county demonstrates its commitment to the highest level of evaluation by complying with the internationally recognized evaluation standards as set forth by the Joint Committee on Standards for Educational Evaluation. So my question is, what are your thoughts if you were to see that? What does it say, do you think, about the coalition? What would this say about the coalition if you saw this? Good. And Christy's talking about improved RFP for state level evaluation. Coalition gets it. Good. Committed to quality evaluation. Yeah. Yeah, right. I mean, it's not a statement that, and I'm reading as I'm talking. That's great. Yeah, that there's efficacy. Kathy talking about they know their stuff, right? Or they're just repeating someone's text. But I would add to that, Kathy said they know their stuff or they're just repeating someone's text, which you could say, right? You could just jot this down and not really do it. So yeah, you'd have to support it. But the mere fact that the coalition is actually aware of those standards, I think probably speaks to something, because I've never seen this before, this type of statement, right? So yeah, and so Rita is asking, yeah, so I'm wondering about the credentials and how do you know that you're able to do that? And we're going to talk about that, right? We're going to talk about what that means. And so on a related question, thank you everybody for that feedback. That is really helpful. I have to pause again. One of the things about this feedback is I'm going to be able to make this feedback available to everyone after the session so you have more time to look it over. I think that getting the feedback, first of all, will help you get a sense of how other people feel about these types of topics, your peers, how do they feel about it? I think that's important. And I think it's important to be able to ponder them, not just have them in this kind of conversational tone where you may forget about it in an hour, but the ability to actually sit and look at it all. So I'm going to be sharing this information with everyone anonymously, of course. The information comes back to me with everybody's name on it, but I don't have to include that section. I can just tell you what people were saying at different points, so you'll be able to follow along with that. And if you need to have conversations in terms of why this type of statement is important, these comments are a great place to start, I think, in talking about this. So everybody, I think, is on the same page that, yeah, that this is a coalition who cares about evaluation. They're working diligently. They know about these standards, which is important. Now, many of you already have an evaluator or an evaluation team. I know that eventually I've been faced many times especially when I was a master trainer for the National Coalition Academy, I was faced many times with the question of how do I find an evaluator, to the point where I I don't know, illegally. I don't know what I did, but I changed the I changed the PowerPoint slides once in a training I was doing, so that it addressed that very question. But how do you find a good evaluator? And in fact, we're going to talk about that a little bit later, because next month that is the primary topic of conversation for the next webinar. But suppose in looking for an evaluator, you saw this statement from the evaluator, maybe in their RFP. When they're responding to it, maybe it's something that's on their website, maybe. What do you think this says about, I guess there are two things. What does this say about the evaluator, do you think? And I'm also wondering if anybody has ever seen an evaluator or heard an evaluator say this, because I'm really interested in that as well. Okay, so Nancy's saying she has not seen it before. Christy hasn't seen it before. We're just talking about a high bar for the evaluator, right? Makes them seem more trustworthy. From Kathy, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, because we've not seen it before, I think it really makes that evaluator stand out a little bit. Because the first question that I would ask, if I can pretend for a moment that I don't have 18 years of experience in doing this, the first question that I would ask is, what the heck are those standards, and how does that affect the work? I think maybe the next question I would ask is, are you going to charge me a lot more, I think, to be honest, because I don't see anybody else use it. So I'd be wondering, how come no one else is using this? Like, why doesn't that happen? Right. So again, thanks for everybody's feedback. That it is a sign of excellence, and it makes the evaluator stand out. So let's talk a little bit. And most of you are a part of, I assume, some type of professional organization. Every organization has standards of some kind, right? That's why that's one of the characteristics of a professional organization, is that they have certain types of standards. So let's talk about standards. And a very simple definition of standards is, standards describe benchmarks for quality, right? And I like to think of this as the building blocks for our purposes, the building blocks of a truly exemplary evaluation. I think it's also important to clarify, because sometimes this can get a little muddy. When we're talking about a good evaluation, we're not talking about having a good intervention strategy, right? The intervention strategy is the intervention strategy. The way that you evaluate it is the evaluation. So you can have a lousy intervention strategy, but still have a great evaluation, and vice versa, right? You could have a great intervention strategy, but a not very good evaluation. So all of this information only applies to the evaluation process itself. And one of the things that I think is important for us to decide right at the beginning, right, is what level of evaluation do we want? What are the kinds of standards that we are going to apply to our process? And standards set the benchmark so that the answer is best, right? I mean, standards are usually something that experts in the field have spent a lot of time agreeing on. And by the way, the JCSEE standards, experts in the field have been working on this, believe it or not, since the 1970s. And they've improved it and refined it many times over. Depending on how the field of evaluation has moved forward dramatically over the last 20 years in terms of what we know about good evaluation, especially at the community level, but also at the program level, right? So we have to make that kind of decision. What kind of standards do we want to apply? And using objective standards that are scientifically driven is one of the choices that we can make, right? I will give everybody a second to absorb the cuteness of the kitten. And why do I have this here? Well, I think the kitten is adorable, staring at itself in the mirror. I think that's awesome. But more importantly, um, you're already using standards if you're doing an evaluation. You may not know what they are, and you may not know where the benchmark is, and you may not know how much it falls in line with scientifically driven standards for evaluation. But if you're doing evaluation, you are, in fact, implementing informally certain evaluation standards. Um, so I think it's important to keep that in mind. And the reason that I put this in here is because your evaluation is a direct reflection, right, of your skill sets and your comfort level. And that's true of any evaluator. That's true of anybody in any profession, that your work is a direct byproduct of the skills you bring to the table and the skills that you're comfortable using, right? So there are lots of skills over the years that I've had more comfort using than others. I am, as we would say, maybe traditionally trained in the social sciences, right? I have a PhD in criminology. So my view of good science falls along those traditional lines of research, right? And what does that look like? And what does that mean? And I bring those skill sets to the table. And that's, especially when I started doing evaluation work, I would fall back a lot on statistics, right? Inferential statistics, causative analysis, all those kinds of things. And maybe wasn't so good at some of the other parts that are important to coalition level evaluation or to just plain evaluation in general, right? Things that I don't do well, I didn't do very much. So you're already engaged in standards is the point of all this. Um, and it's nice to know we do have at least one other evaluator on the call, and I just have to point out that Seamus says he does the same thing, except he uses dogs. I like dogs too. I like dogs too. Um, but I like the recklessness of kittens because they don't care about gravity, and I can respect that. I like that a lot. Um, so you're using those standards. The question is, are they serving you well? That's the question that you should be asking yourself, right? And so when we talk about standards, when we use science-based objective standards, we do a couple of things. There's a couple of benefits to doing that. And one of them is we allow others to compare themselves to us because we all agree on what the appropriate metrics are, right? So it allows us to say not only are the metrics we using science driven, right, best practices, but everybody who uses those standards uses the same metrics. So it becomes very easy to compare ourselves to others in terms of the evaluation process. It creates an objectivity that can be measured. Another thing that it helps us do, and many of you pointed this out when we talked about kind of this statement about a coalition saying that they implement the standards, yeah, it really helps your reputation in the community, right? It shows our ability to demonstrate the highest application of the evaluation. It says, as a couple of you pointed out in your response to when you see this from a coalition, it says that you care about being the best, right? And I think that that makes a statement to partners, to funders, even to people on the coalition, because it sets a very high standard. So standards are important for that as well. It demonstrates that the organization or the folks using those standards have gone out of their way to seek those standards out. And then the last major benefit to using standards just in general, right, is you create a process that's open to scrutiny, right? And it allows us to face critics, number one, right? So people may have maybe not so nice things to say about some of the findings, and you can point out, particularly if the standards are around evaluation, that, hey, we know we're evaluating it right. So questioning the findings, if there are errors in the findings, it's probably not through our evaluation process, right? There may be other things that may create that error, but not the process. And it also helps us understand our efforts. So if things are or are not working out as we want them to, we don't have to worry as much about the fact that maybe there's something going on in our evaluation process that is skewing our data, that is taking us to a place that we don't want to go, right? So it really opens us up and allows us to be upfront, and it shows a very high level of credibility to this process. So let's talk about the standards themselves, the JC standards. So the JC standards are laid out in this book, which some of you may be having trouble making out part of that. But as I said, I do reference the book in one of the handouts. If you look over on the right-hand side, where your control panel is. I assume everybody's control panel is the same place that mine is. But on the control panels, there's a thing that says handouts. You can either open them now on your desktop and look at them, or you can like drag and drop them. They work as any other type of file system. I will stay on a little bit after the webinar so that you can make sure to drag and drop those over. If you need a copy, you can just contact me afterwards. But the point is that the evaluation standards book, along with the evaluation standards we're going to talk about in more detail, but that's under list of standards is one of the handouts, and it does have the proper reference for that book, right? I provide the citation for this and the link to the website on that handout. If your screen is big enough, you can see that there are 5 things at the bottom of the book. Those are the 5 categories that there are for the standards. You should be aware before we dive into this that there are, yes, 30 standards. We obviously are not going to talk about all 30 in any level of detail at all. This is a broad brushstroke to begin a conversation. I am not about to have people sit there and listen to me read off 30 things. But this is also an opportunity for us to be a little interactive. These 30 have been divided into 5 categories. Some of these categories have like 10 standards. Some categories only have, I think there's one that only has 3 standards. So we're going to take a look at each of those. And this is where I would like your help on this. First, I will name and define the category, right? Then I will present the standards that make up the category. So the first step is, okay, this is the name of the category. This is the definition of the category in the form of a question, because I believe that good science answers questions. So what question does this category of standards help you answer? So I'm going to present the standards after I present that question, and I would like your help in telling me what stands out. You're going to have in front of you a list of all the standards, and just it's kind of like one of those psychological ink blot tests, right? So of those standards, what stands out the most to you is what I'm going to be interested in primarily, right? Let me just justify all your hard work that you're going to have to go through when you do that, right? The primary purpose of the webinar, as I said, is to introduce the standards so you can begin a discussion about them with your evaluator or your evaluation team. This is a way of identifying, for you to identify the standards that stand out to you. In other words, maybe providing a foot in the door for this conversation that you're going to have with them. I would also like you to share ideas about what clicks kind of with each other, right? As I said, I'm going to make this information available to everybody so that you can see what kinds of standards really stand out to others in comparison to you. And also for my sake, because these webinars are focused on your needs. In fact, for those of you who got early, like over a month ago, saw the early discussion on what these webinars were going to be, this was not the topic of the second webinar. This webinar and the next webinar are direct results of feedback that I got from the first webinar and from other folks in terms of what they think is important to them. So one of the things that I would be open to, for example, is having webinars on these standards specifically, or maybe one set of them if people think that there's one set that they would really like to know more about or flesh it out in more detail. Having that information helps me from that perspective. It also helps me in the development of tools and materials that might be useful to all of you, right, as you move forward. So maybe there are some standards that are more difficult to talk about than there are other standards. And it's important for me to know that so that I can provide tools that will help with those conversations, right? So again, we're going to use the chat window for that only because I'm just a little afraid of the sound. Haven't done that with this system before, and I know that not everybody's on their computer. I also know that everybody's computer systems are different in terms of echo and stuff like that going on. So I am going to ask you to do it the written way and write all that stuff down. Again, if we do that, I can capture it, and then I can do, I am an evaluator after all, I can do a content analysis and let people know what the most popular themes are. So again, I'm going to lay out what the standard is and then talk about briefly defining it and then put the standards up, and then hopefully if something sticks out to you, if you could put that in the chat window. So let's start with the first standard, which is called utility. And utility helps us ask the question, do stakeholders find that evaluation products and processes meet their needs, right? So this one is all about, are the products and processes of the evaluation meeting the need of whoever the stakeholders are? Within this, then, I think there are 8 standards, and these are the 8 standards. I'll just quickly read them off. And if you could put in the chat box anything that stands out to you, and maybe a quick explanation as to why. So there's evaluator credibility, there's attention to stakeholders, there's negotiated purposes, explicit values, relevant information, meaningful processes and products, timely and appropriate communicating and reporting, and concern for consequence and influence. Those are the standards that are referred to as utility. So if anybody has any questions first, or if you could just kind of put in the chat window, which of these 8 stand out to you for whatever reason? Okay, so sorry, I had my mic on on mute there for a second. So let's talk about negotiated purposes first, right? Negotiated purposes is basically, are you able to renegotiate what the evaluation looks like and what you're evaluating as you go along, right? Evaluations should be fluid, moving animals, right? Because your communities that you're evaluating, or even if you're doing a program, people are constantly in motion, right? There are constantly things that are coming along. If you're responsible for a program, there are things always going on that might impact the outcomes of that program that maybe you didn't account for. Certainly in communities, there may be something or a series of things that happens in the community that might impact a whole range of issues. Do you have an open process for being able to do that? And a lot of you identified negotiated purposes as being one of the things that was important. I think there was a question for explicit values and what that means. And here we're looking at kind of the cultural values that set the context for the evaluation. It has something to do with cultural sensitivity, right? But it's more than just cultural sensitivity. It's about, in our evaluation design and our ability to make judgments and draw conclusions and all of that, are we accounting appropriately for culture in this? So it's not just about, I know that, I know that there are some communities I've worked with, for example, that will not do web-based surveys for parents because they know that a lot of parents in those communities are not on the internet or not on the internet regularly. It's more than just that, right? It's the whole purpose of evaluation. How are you reporting things? How are you collecting things? What conclusions are you drawing? Is there some type of cultural bias, right, in there? And Jean asks an interesting question: whose burden is the timely communication part? I'm gonna make some people not like me very much right now. I've had this conversation with someone before. It's up to the evaluator, and I hate to say it, but when you're going to implement these kinds of standards, it's important that the evaluator, of course, is on board because they need to lead the charge on this. So timeliness, what does that mean? Needs to be a negotiated, goes back to the negotiated purposes, right? It needs to be a negotiated communication. So here you can see how there's a lot of interplay, even between segments of just utility, right? Because communication is one of the negotiated purposes. There may be things that impact just your ability to communicate. Or there may be things that impact how often you should communicate. Maybe something happens and you go, gee, we really need feedback more often. That's why it's important, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, the art, what I call the art of evaluation. It's important to have flexibility in a good evaluation so that you're able to do that. So it looks like negotiation is one of the big things. Someone did mention concern for consequences, right? And I know that a lot of evaluation maybe doesn't do this as often or in a way that they should, right? What are some unintended, perhaps, consequences of what we're doing? Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody, for sharing your thoughts on that. I think that was very helpful. It would have been more helpful if I would have unmuted my mic earlier. So let's go to the next one, which is feasibility, right? Feasibility asks the question, is the evaluation effective and efficient, right? And so we'll talk about this. This really has to do with process, and there's only four here. How is it being managed? What are the procedures that are going on? What's the context? And notice that it doesn't ask just the context, but it says contextual visibility, right? Which means we're talking about exposing the context. And here we're back into culture and political interests and things like that they should be exposed through evaluation. And then resource use. How are we using resources in our evaluation? Are we using them appropriately? So are there any of these four that stand out to people? Most of this is about how do we manage the evaluation. So someone is offering contextual visibility, and Rita actually wants to know if that's a tightrope. Yeah, it can be. Yeah. Now, one of the things that we also want to keep in mind about following the standards, and thank you, Rita, for that statement, because this is an important issue around that. I would not realistically say that something like contextual visibility, anything like that, I would never assume that that's something that should be on the front page of the New York Times. So part of the conversation about applying standards is who gets this reported to them, right? That you're following this. Now remember, when we're talking about having standards, as we'll talk about a little bit later, what we're really talking about is, can you document that you do this? So when we are talking about, for example, matching feasibility standards, we don't have to put what the findings are in there to say that we're doing it. We just have to say what kinds of documentation are we using, for example, to track contextual visibility. Are there things that we are doing that help us do that? The conclusions of those things, that's where the tightrope comes in, right, Rita? Because the information itself probably isn't going to lead to a lot of problems, but maybe if it gets in the wrong hands, maybe. So it's important to think about who are the people that are going to examine that documentation. And that's actually one of the standards that we're going to get to at the end. It's called meta-evaluation. And so it's important to think about, who's going to track these standards and how is it going to be documented? So that's a really good question. Thank you, Rita. Christy says that are you still intrigued, Christy, or was that enough information? I don't. Everybody is putting contextual visibility, and it is visibility, not viability. Everybody's putting contextual visibility as the one that's most important. And as I said, what we're looking for in these standards is just, can we document that we do it? So, and again, this is just broad brushstrokes, right, folks? I mean, I'm spitting a lot of information to you right now. So that's why I think it's important that I came up with a list of the standards so we can look them over in a second, all of them, well, in a couple minutes. And this really needs to be examined more carefully. This is just kind of that opening conversation to have. So thank you again for pointing out that contextual visibility stands out in that group. So let's get to the third one, which is propriety. And it's just like the word means, right? Is the evaluation proper, just, legal, and is it fair? So what would you have to document here to show that you are doing that? And here we have the list of 7 standards that are related to propriety. Right. So we have responsive and inclusive orientation, formal agreements, human rights and respect, clarity and fairness, transparency and disclosure, conflicts of interest, and fiscal responsibility. Is there anything here that stands out? I see that some of you have already opened the worksheet, so that's good. That's good. And we're under propriety standards. Oh, and Joy pointed out that on the worksheet it does say contextual viability, so it must be a typo on my end. I always assume that I'm the one that made the mistake, not visibility for feasibility standards. So that should be viability, not visibility. Thank you for pointing that out, Joy. So is there anything here that stands out? Kathy said that the inclusive orientation stands out. Seamus talking about transparency. Okay, so I feel like an auctioneer. So conflict of interest stands out, sure. That might even refer to the tightrope that was referred to earlier, right? But we certainly want to be able to address conflicts of interest. And again, what we're trying to identify is conflicts of interest within the evaluation process, right? Are there any potential conflicts of interest? And again, in the name of science, what this is about is, are we documenting what those conflicts of interest are? It's not suggesting that the standard is to solve them. It's suggesting that the standard is to document what they are. So then it's up to whoever is doing the work to see if they want to adjust them in some way. Okay. So let's move on to the one that most people probably are implementing at some informal level. So, probably a lot of these standards are new language. Someone had mentioned that a lot of this is new language. But this is where you're going to find some familiarity, probably. Accuracy are the propositions, findings, representations of the evaluation dependable and truthful, right? And so this, you're going to find some stuff that looks familiar, probably. And probably evaluators spend a lot of time talking about this one. These types of issues. So justified conclusions, valid information, reliable information, right? Yay, science. Explicit program and context descriptions, information management, sound design and analysis, explicit evaluation reasoning, and communication and reporting. I do have to confess that every time I see sound design and analysis, I think of my home theater. But what they're referring to there is your methodology, right? Are you engaged in proper methods? So is there anything here that stands out to anyone in terms of accuracy? Is this the part where I go, Bueller? Bueller? It's possible that none of it really stands out, I guess. When forced into it, Seamus talks about communication and reporting. Yeah. A whole topic unto itself that people have talked about. How do we do that, right? And I think what's most important, since we're on the topic before we move on to the next one, is that if we read over that sheet on communication and reporting, notice that it doesn't involve the issue of how do you communicate to an audience, right? Do you put it on slides? Do you put it in a newsletter? Do you whatever? That's not what this is about, right? This one is about making sure that the information that you're putting out there cannot be misconstrued as something else, that it doesn't contain any distortions. And so in a sense, what we're asking about here is, can you document in a way a kind of fact checking of the stuff that you're communicating, right? Is there another set of eyes that's looking at this and checking for this kind of stuff? Again, it's all about the evaluation process. So yeah, so folks who are talking about science, right, all focus on the sound design, right, and analysis. And yeah, I think this is the place that most people really rely. The sound design analysis, I would agree, Christy, that this is the place that most people really rely heavily on an evaluator, under the assumption that the evaluator knows something about evaluation methodology, right? Which is similar in many ways to research, but also has some important differences as well, right? So there are basic things around reliability and validity, but they kind of look differently in evaluation than they do in research. And so that kind of goes to, right, sound design and analysis. That was one of my strengths, for example, looking in the mirror, the evaluation reflected what I was doing, I had a really strong background, obviously, in um, research design and research analysis because of my educational background. And that was one of the things that I had to adapt, and go, oh, this isn't a social science experiment, which makes makes it a little differently. It's a little different, right? So again, all of these are about, can you demonstrate, or how do you demonstrate that you're documenting these processes, right? That you're covering all of these. So let's move on to the next one, which is the last of them. It's called evaluation accountability. This also, by the way, is the newest. Originally, there were only 4, but they added a 5th a while back. Do you have adequate documentation to assess your evaluation processes and products for the purposes of improvement and accountability? And this is exactly the kind of stuff that we have been talking about, right? Which means, do you have the appropriate evaluation documentation about all of the other standards? And then some new language around internal and external meta evaluation, right? So that's probably new language. If you're a researcher, actually, meta analysis is a little bit different than it is here. Here, it's basically asking about transparency, right? Which basically means, do you have people who are currently part of the evaluation, that is there a process in place for them to document and assess if they're following the standards and what the evaluation looks like? But also, is there an outside group that can take a look at what you're doing and reach some level of agreement with the internal group about, we're doing a good job of fulfilling these standards, right? So it's saying, do you have someone external to the evaluation who is taking a critical look at it? Do any of these 3 stand out? Make more sense? Need more clarification? And because it's just the way my brain works, I do want to point out that as we got deeper into the conversation, there was less and less feedback as we move forward. So I don't know if that's a sign that people are doing other things, or if that's a sign that the things stood out less as we moved through the 5. And if I would have put them in a different order, that may have turned out differently. But see, I just thought I would give you something inside the mind of an evaluator. This is what we do. We make observations like this. So having talked about that, most of you do, or I guess a lot of you probably have the document open. At the bottom of document is a 2-page document. At the bottom is the citation for the book. So let's do a review. First of all, again, thank you for your input on all these. I know that it's probably a little more interactive than you're used to in a webinar. I know that for me, webinars usually are a chance for me to put the webinar on, put the sound up, and then go do something else, as long as I have the sound on as background noise or whatever. So I did require a lot of energy, and I do appreciate you being able to do that. So let's review a little bit and then talk about some closing thoughts that we need to keep in mind, and give some advice in terms of what our next steps should be. So we talked about the basic categories. They are utility, feasibility, propriety, accuracy, and evaluation accountability. And now let's talk about next steps, right? If this information you think is useful to you in terms of what your program or your coalition is doing, there are some final thoughts that we should keep in mind in terms of what we should be doing next. As I said, this webinar is about beginning a conversation. Most of you probably have not been exposed to these standards before, and we'll talk about some, for some reason now the meta evaluation stuff is coming up. So there are some things that did stand out in that last one, mostly around the meta evaluation, and we can certainly talk about that. and what kind of documentation that would require. But if we're going to begin this conversation, again, broad brushstrokes here, right? How do we even begin a conversation with something we don't know anything about? So let me give you a flag about something, because when I talk to someone else whose opinion I greatly respect on this kind of information, they said, one of the things that people may think, and I hope that there are evaluators on the line, they don't feel this way, that golly, are you saying that if your evaluator hasn't said this to you, that they're a stinky evaluator and they don't know what they're doing? And the answer to that is no, right? But I would offer that it probably is important to know what are the standards that your evaluator is using. What does that mean? And the other thing I would say is it's not a red flag if this isn't something that's been brought to your table as a coalition person or as a program provider from your evaluator. I would consider it, I do have to say this, and I apologize for folks who may take it personally, but I would have to say that once this information is brought to them, however, if there's pushback from them, that could be a potential red flag, right? Because one of the things that's very clear about this documenting these standards is it means extra work, not for the coalition, but for the evaluator, right? And there may be evaluators some of whom may never have been exposed to these standards before. I know that I worked for years in evaluation without really having a full understanding of this. So, again, taking advantage mostly of just my skill sets and what they were and trying to make the best of that, and things that I was learning as I went along. That doesn't mean that you have a bad evaluator just because they never heard of these. If they're not willing to flex a little bit here and work with you on this, that might be a different issue, and it's not really an issue around their ability to apply standards as much as just a communication issue between you and your evaluator, right? I mean, if you tell your evaluator that something might be important to your coalition and that they might be able to help and they provide pushback, that's probably not a good thing in terms of communication. But certainly it does not mean that the evaluators who you're using now, if they've not brought this to your attention, that somehow you should change up. That's not what it means at all. This is an opening conversation with them to just take to them and say, hey, let's talk about this. Now, having said that, I will also offer this. Whoever's going to be in charge of leading this charge needs to read the book. And the reason I say that is, and I have familiarity with this. I'm going to talk about some things that the authors of the book talk about, and you really do need to have a really deep understanding of these concepts and how they work together in order to really be effective. So buying the book is something that is probably important. But how do we begin the conversation then with folks around this? So I've given you a couple of tools that I hope are helpful. One of them, many of you have already looked at, right? And that's the evaluation standards checklist. Now, there's a couple of things, I know that you can't see it very well on here, but when you open it, one of the things that you're going to notice is that every standard has a letter and a number. They did this as a way of shorthand, so you don't have to write out utility standard 1 every time, or feasibility standard 1, right? That you could just put U1, U2, U3, and then you would have a code sheet that would let you know what that was. So that's all those numbers are. So if you want to create a spreadsheet or something using them, it just saves a lot of space on that spreadsheet. And so this is an introduction then to the terms. The website that this is taken from is at the top, and as I said, the book reference is at the bottom on the second page of this. And it's something to think about. Who would you like to look these standards over, and who do you have the initial conversations about this with? Like, who are you going to talk to about this? And this might be a good introduction to those standards for them and for you to talk about with them. In addition, the content analysis that I'm going to provide to everybody who was on the webinar might be another thing, because maybe you can then asterisk or something on this list and say, hey, here are the things that really came up in the webinar that we were talking about. These are the things that people had questions about or wanted to know about, right? So this tool hopefully will be helpful. What you might be able to do, and how do you begin to look at what are your standards. So as I said, everybody is doing standards already if you're doing evaluation. I think the trick is to figure out, can you do that more intentionally and more formally? all right, because informal standards have a way of breaking down sometimes. So what I did is I provided this list. I just put the standards down. Notice I used the identifier with the letter and the number. I did write the description in. And then the next column is about documentation. And basically, it's just asking you to list what documentation you have that might speak to that standard. So for example, the first standard, U1, is evaluator credibility. And so what I would do is I would then take a look at the list and I would look at the definition of evaluator credibility. And in that definition of evaluator credibility, I would find that maybe one of the things that I could use to document evaluator credibility is maybe their resume, right? If it has a lot of information about how they are perceived, how much credibility do they have in the field, the number of people that they've worked with, all those types of things could speak to credibility. I might do an informal conversation with members of the board or members of the community, maybe, if they know them, and ask just, what do you think about this person as an evaluator, and then just take those findings and say, hey, I've had conversations with people who have told me that they think the evaluator is very credible. So it's thinking about kind of what's the documentation that you already have, because you already have documentation on some of these. And certainly by the feedback that I've been getting, probably a lot of it falls into that valid information, reliable information, explicit program. This is where it really comes down to the evaluator to take a look at this list and go, okay, where's the documentation? Where does it exist? Now, I want to cross-reference this very quickly before we go on to kind of 3 principles to keep in mind, is that many of you identified certain things that stood out to you, right? And so a lot of those themes were about transparency and communication and all of that. So certainly one of the things that I would begin a conversation with my evaluator on is, if those concepts are important to you, if those standards are important to you, then I'm hoping that your communication is well enough with your evaluator that they would be able to tell you what documentation they have that shows they're doing those things that you've identified as most important, right? Because again, the evaluator works for you. The evaluation team works for you. It's there to make sure that that first thing about utility is being upheld, right? So we want to make sure that they're meeting the needs of the coalition as we go forward. So we are going to be looking at that. Okay. Christy Miller, who is not an evaluator, says that, it can be a little scary. So that's why I'm hoping that these tools will help you have just that beginning conversation. And remember, the conversation is not about, are your methods good, right? Are the evaluation methods good? It's, can you document why you're using those methods? It's all just about documenting if that stuff exists. So for example, if we take, and this is where the art of this comes in, and then I promise I'll move on to the next thing, but these things are interrelated, as we've already pointed out. And if your evaluator is the only person who understands the evaluation design, that violates about 3 or 4 standards, right? Because obviously what happened is they're going to have a lot of trouble documenting that. One, the thing that was important to folks was this idea of negotiated purposes, that there wasn't much of a negotiation, that they apparently were the only people that made this decision, right? And again, it's not about negotiating with everyone necessarily, but maybe there's an evaluation subcommittee and maybe they didn't even talk about it, right? So it's just important to make sure that these do work together in a process. And that's kind of where the art is, and that's why you have to, understand all of these things and how they work together. And I do want to point out just really quickly that Seamus wrote in his window, I'm the internal evaluator for our coalition. So again, it's important for the evaluator to be able to identify who they are in all of this, right? Are they part of the internal or external team? They probably would always be the internal team if they're being paid, or if there's some agreement that says they're going to provide the lead on evaluation, they are definitely internal. So if you think that having other eyes on this evaluation is really important. So it's important that everybody can identify where you are in terms of that meta-evaluation stuff. So a couple of rules that I've alluded to, and I've been very verbose probably about that, but let's sum it all up into 3 important lessons that we want to have. First of all, this is one of my favorite works of art. Thank goodness it's here in DC. So I get to go visit it every once in a while. But make no mistake that good evaluation is an art form, and so is using these standards. It is important to remember that you can't just develop a checklist, which is why I did not do that, of these standards and go, yes, we do this, we sort of do this, yes, we do that. That's not what this is about. The standards do not stand apart separately. At any given time, in any given place, there is no standard that is universally more important than any other standard. As you can see, they all interrelate, right? So the art then of understanding this is, how do they interrelate, right? What does that look like? And I'm not saying that that's an easy thing to practice, but what I am saying is that the first thing you have to do is understand that they're even there. So the first step then of this art is just as an artist maybe, is knowing how to use a brush, right? Or knowing what colors are available to you and knowing what kinds of surfaces you could paint on. That's all this conversation is. This is just a conversation about, here's a paintbrush, here are the colors you have, here's how you can mix them together, and here's what a canvas looks like. So next steps will move forward. Another important principle to keep in mind is that the standards work best when they work together, just like people, right? Which is why I have these people all together, right? We know from the research is very clear that groups of people are smarter than individuals. And again, none of these standards objectively can be set apart as more important than any other standard. The other thing is that standards will become more or less important depending on what your needs are as a coalition, or as a program, or as a project, and you're moving forward. So there might be some standards that are really important in the phase that you're at now, and other standards that maybe aren't so important for you. So again, it's important to identify what are the standards that you think really are applicable for where you are as a coalition. And then the last lesson is, before you can really move forward with this, in terms of this understanding it as an art, I mean, you can certainly document whether you have stuff, but understanding how they're interrelated really does require a deeper understanding of how these work together. And I almost never do this. For those of you who know me, I never do it. I try to cheat the same as everybody else as much as possible and go on Wikipedia, because I think that they tell me everything I need to know most of the time. This is not one of those times, unfortunately. Reading the book does help. They provide examples. They show how things are interrelated. So, while at a base level, they just generate the same list that they have online. For a deeper understanding in terms of the application, probably the book is helpful. But you probably only want one copy because it's outrageously expensive, though you can rent it for like $23 for a month, which is what I did, because I'm not going to spend $75 on the book if I can just rent it for less, right? So that was the summary of evaluation standards. As I said, I know it's a lot of information. There were 30 things that got thrown at you. Hopefully, some of this information will be useful to you. I would like to announce that next month we do have the next requested topic, and the next requested topic in this series was evaluating your evaluation, finding the right evaluator, getting the most from your evaluation. We'll make some reference to today's webinar. We'll make some reference to the first webinar as we do this. But this is really about kind of what are the skill sets then that are involved, whether you're going to have standards or not standards. What are the skill sets that are involved in a good evaluation, and how do you, I guess, figure that out? So we'll talk a little bit about meta-evaluation and how all that works. And so that's going to be, again, on June 8th at noon. If there are questions about this, there are two ways to contact me. One of them involves a lot of writing. wgary@globalevaluationsolutions.com. That's the one if you really like typing a lot of letters and you're not afraid of no spaces. help@coalitionevaluation.com is probably the easiest. Some of you probably have other emails. Also check out I know this sounds really weird to say. I feel like one of my kids. Check out our YouTube channel. But no, this webinar will be posted on there. I am going to provide everybody with the link to that. If there are any questions or other issues that people have, please feel free to email me. You will hear from me again on this topic. I'm going to send out a survey so I can measure your satisfaction with what we covered today and see if you have any ideas about future webinars and what they should look like, and what we can do to improve this process for you. So if there are final questions or comments, I will keep this line open for a little bit longer. I appreciate all of your patience and appreciate your interest in this topic. So I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye. So I noticed that there's still a few people that are on, and just wanted to let you know that in about a minute I'm going to be closing the window. If you have trouble getting the handouts, feel free to just send me an email, and I will pass them along to you. Thank you.